Many thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. So I'm in this local woodland area that's kind of synonymous for these holly bushes. You know, it's a very, it's the holidays, it's a very festive tree or bush, and this area is just covered with tons of them. And I had this, idea in my mind of a little bit of frost, a little bit of fog, the sun rising behind it, and using a longer lens and really kind of throwing out of focus the background. And I've gotten into this really bad habit lately of, pre-visualizing everything, and basically what that ultimately does will make you hunt very specific conditions, certain types of light, certain types of atmosphere, certain types of temperatures. And I've had this shot in mind, honestly, for like the last 2 or 3 holidays, and I just never quite had the conditions. And I've gotten into this real bad habit the last couple of years of only going out when the conditions are absolutely perfectly conducive for the idea I've built up in my mind. And ultimately what that leads to is not doing a lot of photography and doing a whole lot of weather scouting and weather research. It just seems that if you spend a ton of time waiting for the perfect conditions, you're just never going to get out there. And what I have found lately is that when the conditions are not predicted to be ideal, that is when the conditions are the best. And that's usually the time that I am sitting in my living room having a cup of coffee, looking out the window, just shaking my head, going, that was the day to get out there. So nevertheless, I'm just trying to stop doing that as much this year. I've done it a ton, and just kind of get out whenever I have time to get out, regardless of the conditions, and just hope for the best. You never know what you're going to get. So what I'm trying to do with this scene is, let me just adjust the screen brightness so you can see it. I guess that's okay. I'm trying to create a more intimate scene, zoomed into the branches, or to the holly berries on this particular branch right through here. And I'm using a longer lens. This is my Fuji 55-200 on the Fuji X-T3, and I'm zoomed into 70 millimeters. And I'm doing that to really throw the background out of focus, just to kind of create a little bit more of a simplistic scene here. But the issue that I'm having is trying to get every one of these holly berries in perfect focus on this particular branch. So I'm going to end up having to focus stack this. I'm at f3.6, so a very shallow depth of field. So I'll probably end up having to do maybe a 2 or 3 shot focus stack for certain areas of the actual branch. Now, even though this isn't a super high dynamic range scene, the sun is rising in the general direction behind the hollyberry tree. And there are a lot of areas of the actual hollyberry, the leaves and the berries itself, creating a lot of shadow area on the branches itself. So whenever I expose for the highlights, I get a lot of these really, really dark shadow pockets on the actual branch itself. And in order to solve that, a real quick way to fix it is just to bracket exposures. And I'm also going to be focus stacking, and it's something that I get a question about from time to time about, can you expose your bracket and focus stack at the same time? And you absolutely can. And it sounds a lot more daunting of a task than it actually is. It's pretty simple. And the way that I do it is, I'll first go ahead and pick my perfect exposure, or the version of the image that I think is the best expose, I should say. And for this situation, I'm at f3.6, a shutter speed of 1/30th of a second. There's really no wind, so I don't have to worry about kind of freezing any action in the branch moving around. And I'm at an ISO 640. And I'm going to use this as my base exposure. So what I'll do is I will go ahead and move a focus point, or just touch the screen, to this area of the holly berries, and I'll take that image, and I'll move my focus point here, take that image, and move my focus point here and take that image. That way I get all areas of the actual hollyberry branch in focus. And then I will usually take a photo of my hand right there, and I'll show you later why that's important when I go ahead and process these images or blend them together. And then I'm going to go ahead and take another set of images with a darker exposure. And all I'm doing is just adjusting my shutter speed right here. And I think I'm going to use that as a darker version. And then I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing. An image focus right there, image focus right there, image focus right there, and take an image of my hand. And then I'm going to do one final version, which is going to be the brighter version right here. And I'm going to do the same thing. Image focus there, image focus there, and image focus there. And then finally take an image for my hand. So we're ultimately going to be left with a total of 9 images. It's going to be a 3-shot focus stack series for each different exposure level. And we have 3 different exposure levels. We have our proper exposure, we have a darker exposure for the highlights, and a lighter exposure for the shadows. We're going to blend everything together in post, and you'll ultimately be left with that perfectly exposed, razor sharp image where each one of the holly berries on this branch are in perfect focus, and it's all well exposed. We won't have any of those kind of like really dark pockets of area that's being created by the hollyberry leaves are casting different little shadows all across the branch. And we'll be able to avoid that by blending all those exposures together as well. Now, if any of that sounded confusing, it definitely sounds a lot more confusing than it really is. It's a pretty simple process, and I think the entire process probably only takes maybe 5 minutes just to blend everything together. It's very simple to do. So I'm going to go ahead and pack things up here, and I'm going to head back to my house, and I'll show you exactly how I would post-process this focus stack and exposure bracket series, just to blend everything together to a single final image. Now, if you're not familiar with what exposure bracketing or focus stacking is, I will put 2 links in the description of this video that will take you to videos that I created on both of these topics earlier this year, or maybe one of them was towards the end of last year. But that should help clear up any potential outstanding questions that you might have in regards to both exposure bracketing and focus stacking. So in this scenario where I want to create an exposure bracketed series and a focus stack series and blend them together, my approach is load everything into Lightroom or your photo editor of choice, and you're left with a group of images that looks like this. And you can see right here, these are the pictures of my palm. And these basically serve as kind of like bookmarks to let me know where one focus stack series begins and where one focus stack series ends. Seeing groups of exposure bracketed series is much simpler because the exposures are very obvious. But seeing different focus stack series in a Lightroom catalog, or when you have a bunch of images together, gets a little bit difficult without having to zoom into each individual photograph to figure out which one is which. So I always like to put my my hand in front of the lens, take a photo just to use as a bookmark to kind of break those up to make it easy for me to identify. So what I'll do is come up here to the very first image. So this is the what I deem the proper exposure, and these are the 3 images. This is the darker exposure right through here, and then this is the brighter exposure for the shadows right through here, with my palm breaking up all 3. So it just makes it very simple to identify which areas are which. So what I like to do is come up to the image, and I'm going to put a real quick edit on it, but I always leave the exposure alone. And as you can see, this is the edit I put on this one, and the exposure is not adjusted at all. And I do that because I want the exposure to remain as it is when I took the images on location, because that's going to be part of the exposure bracketed series. So I can edit everything in the photograph that I want, but I will always leave the exposure the same. And then I'm going to come back up here to library, and I'm going to basically highlight everything, all of the images, and then come up here to the one I started with, right click, and I'm going to come down here to, what am I looking for? Develop settings and sync settings right through here. And this is basically going to give me the option to sync all of the settings across all of the images. And the most important part of it is it'll also sync that no adjustment to the exposure across all of them as well. So they're all going to receive the very same edit, but they're all going to receive no adjustment to the exposure. And I think that's the most important part. And then what I will do is, once all of these images have the same edit applied to them, I will start with each focus bracket or focus stack series, highlight them right here, right click, edit in, open as layers in Photoshop. And in an effort of time, or to respect your time, I went ahead and did it right here. And this is the very first image right here. And you can see that there's all three of the layers are automatically applied to this particular image. And this is the image that is the, well, I guess the version that I deemed as the proper exposure. So in each one of these layers indicates or represents each individual photograph. So what I will do is I will highlight all three, and this portion right here is for the actual focus stack. So I'm going to align all these together, blend them together, and it's real simple to do just by coming up here to Edit, Auto Align Layers, and I always leave this on Auto right here, and I select OK. And it's basically what Photoshop is doing, just blending all three of these images together, just to make sure that maybe you didn't bump your tripod or something changed. Just kind of align everything as best as it possibly can. And then what I will do once that is complete is leave all three of these layers selected, come back up to Edit, and go to Auto Blend Layers. And I'm going to leave this on Stack Images right here and hit OK. And now what Photoshop is doing, it usually takes just a few seconds, doesn't take too terribly long. But Photoshop is looking for the areas of greatest focus for each one of these images, and will basically create a mask only using the portions of each photograph that are in focus. And you're ultimately left with one final version that is completely focused in all different aspects of your photograph, at least wherever you placed your focus points in the particular image. And as you can see, it just completed, and there now is a fourth layer, and this is the merge layer right here, as you can see. And if I turn this one off and I turn off each one of these layers, you can see which areas of this photograph were used, or that Photoshop deemed as the areas that have the greatest focus. And it ultimately created this merge layer right here. And as you can see now, if I zoom in up here, this area is in focus and this area is in focus right through here as well. And you can see that this area is not in focus. And this is actually a perfect example of why I always say, whenever you're creating a focus stack series, take way more images than you think you need, because there's nothing worse than creating a focus stack series and then you blend everything together only to realize that there's a portion of your scene that is still out of focus because you should have put a focus point there and captured that image as well. So if I think I need 3 images or 3 different areas for a particular series, I usually will take 5 or 6 just to be careful and to be safe. If you don't need them, you can just throw them away, but it's better to have them than to not have them at all, which is the scenario that I have right here. But what I'll do now is I go ahead and I'll do that with all 3 of these different versions. And as you can see, this is the darker version for the highlights. This is the brighter version for the shadows. And I already did the focus stack and auto align on all 3 of these versions right through here. And then once I have it all done, I'll just come up here to File and I'll hit Save and save everything back to Lightroom. So I'll end up with one version, one completely focus stack version for each one of these exposure blends. And then once all of that is back inside of Lightroom, I am left with this right here. So this is the darker version, which is focus stacked. This is the brighter version, or actually this is the reasonable or properly exposed version, focus stacked. And then this is the brighter version, focus stacked. And then what you can do at that point is you can either click all 3 of these, right click, you can come up here to photo merge, and you can do an HDR blend inside of Lightroom. Sometimes that works out okay. Or you can manually blend it inside of Photoshop. You can use the paintbrush, you can use luminosity masks. But at that point, you have the focus stack series created for each one of those exposure blends. And then you can just blend those 3 images together to use certain areas of exposure throughout the photographs that you see is the biggest benefit to that overall photograph, whether that's just using the HDR function inside of Lightroom or Capture One, or like I said, you can manually do it inside of Photoshop as well. This image probably isn't the best example because there wasn't a ton of dynamic range in this overall photograph. There was some areas of shadows that were definitely resolved. And here is the final version right through here. I ended up just using the HDR blend function inside of Lightroom, and it did a really good job. And you can see it's just a little bit better properly exposed. It's a little bit cleaner of an image because I didn't have to crank up the shadows in order to resolve some of these darker areas right through here. I was able to just kind of leave the shadows really as they were and just use the darker exposure and the brighter exposure just to blend everything together, just kind of create a little bit of a cleaner photograph. So I do like the way the overall photograph came out. I know I mentioned this at the beginning of the video. These are not the conditions that I was hoping for. This image would be substantially better with a little bit of frost, a little bit of fog, a little bit of backlight coming through. But I've been waiting and waiting and waiting for those conditions, and every time I think the conditions aren't going to happen, it seems to be when the conditions do occur. So I'm just going to keep going out whenever I have time, regardless of what the conditions are, to see if I can capture this photograph. So I do hope that that information was helpful. Like I said, I do get questions quite a bit about, is it possible to do a focus stack in an exposure blend? And it absolutely is. It just takes a little bit longer, but it doesn't take too terribly long at all, but it's definitely something that you can very, very easily do. Now, before I do wrap up this week's video, I do want to say a quick thank you again to the sponsor of this week's video, which is Squarespace, who I use for all of my website and e-commerce needs. Squarespace provides a dynamic and attractive online platform to create your website. You can display your photography using Squarespace's professional portfolio designs and customize the layout and look and feel of your gallery just so you can make it your own. With Squarespace's traffic overview feature, you can track trends in page visits and views to better optimize your content, and you can even grow and engage with your customers with Squarespace's email campaign tools, which will enable you to create engaging emails that match your website with your products or blog post and logo, just so your messaging remains consistent. So if you're looking to start a new website or possibly upgrade your current website, check out squarespace.com/Mark Denney for a free trial and 10% off your first purchase. So I do hope you enjoyed this week's video. I hope it cleared up any potential questions that you might have in regards to exposure bracketing and focus stacking at the same time. As always, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments section below, and I guarantee I will get back in touch with you. And if you did enjoy this week's video, if you could give it that thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed already. And as always, I really do appreciate you watching this week's video, and I will see you all next Wednesday. Bye.